In the global work environment, you cannot really choose the persons whom you work with. As you join a business organization, you should expect to be working with persons coming from different educational, religious, economic, political, and cultural backgrounds. How to make your work environment enjoyable and productive entails cohesive relationship with other workers, and this in turn entails coping up with intercultural and multicultural barriers. As you've learned in the other lesson, culture is the sum of a society's shared system of symbols, beliefs, attitudes, customs, traditions, values, expectations, way of life, and norms of behavior. Intercultural communication, on the other hand, is the process of transmitting and receiving messages between and among people whose different cultural backgrounds lead them to interpret verbal and nonverbal signs differently. Two trends contributing to the rapidly increasing importance of intercultural communication in the workplace are market globalization and the multicultural workforce. Market globalization is the increasing tendency of the world to act as one market. This trend is being driven by the technological advances in travel and telecommunications. For example, advanced communication technology allows participants from all over the world to work together and share information without leaving their desks or homes. The pandemic, in fact, has dramatically changed the paradigm of market globalization. Multicultural workforce pertains to the cultural diversity of language, race, gender, culture, family structure, religion, and educational background of members of an international business organizations. Workforces in business process outsourcing or BPO environments best exemplify this trend. A company's cultural diversity affects how its business messages are conceived, composed, delivered, received, and interpreted. Ethnocentrism pertains to the group's tendency to judge all other groups according to their own standards, behaviors, and customs. In the judgment, theirs is always superior than the others. Ethnocentrism is a cultural communication barrier. The key to an effective intercultural communication is sensitivity to cultural differences. In our preliminary topics in purposive communication, you learned about cultural barriers. Here, the highlight of intercultural communication is that diversity does not mean indifference to people of different cultural backgrounds. Within a culture, there exist subcultures, which pertain to the distinct groups that exist within a major cultural demographic, including an ethnic group, religious group, profession, or gender community. Besides language, subcultures are marked by their distinct practices, beliefs, attitudes, and behavior. Cultures vary in how quickly or easily they change. They differ in the degree of complexity and in their tolerance toward outsiders. One of the ways people assign meaning to a message is according to cultural context, which pertain to the pattern of physical cues, environmental stimuli, and implicit understanding that convey meaning between two members of the same culture. From culture to culture, people convey contextual meaning differently. Correct social behavior in effective communication can be defined by how much culture depends on contextual cues. Here, one must understand the concepts of high context culture and low context culture. In high context cultures such as Korea and Taiwan, people rely less on verbal communication and more on the context of non-verbal actions and environmental setting to convey meaning. A Chinese speaker uses indirectness and metaphors to convey a web of meanings. In high-context cultures, the rules of everyday life are rarely explicit. Instead, as individuals grow up, they learn how to recognize situational cues, such as gestures and tone of voice, and how to respond as expected. In low-context cultures such as the United States and Germany, people rely more on verbal communication and less on circumstances and cues to convey meaning. An English speaker feels responsible for transmitting the meaning of the message and often places sentences in chronological and logical sequences to establish a coherent discourse. In low-context cultures, rules and expectations are usually spelled out through explicit statements such as "please wait until I'm finished eating." Contextual differences affect the way cultures approach situations such as decision-making, problem-solving, and negotiating. First, in decision-making, in low-context cultures, business people try to reach decisions quickly and efficiently. They are concerned with reaching an agreement on the main points, leaving the details to be worked out later by others. However, in a high-context culture such as Greece, executives assume that anyone who ignores the details is being evasive and untrustworthy. They believe that spending time on each little point is a mark of good faith. In terms of problem solving, in low-context US executives typically enjoy confrontation and debate, unlike high-context Japanese executives who may use a third party to avoid the unpleasant feelings that might result from open conflict. Chinese executives also try to prevent public conflict by avoiding counter-proposal methods. Chinese team members cannot back down from a position without losing face, so trying to persuade them to do so will ruin the relationship. Finally, in terms of negotiating, low-context Canadian and German negotiators tend to view negotiations as impersonal, setting their goals in economic terms and trusting the other party, at least at the outset. However, high-context Japanese negotiators prefer a more sociable negotiating atmosphere, one conducive to forging personal ties as the basis for trust. They see immediate economic gains as secondary to establishing and maintaining a long-term relationship. Cultural context also influences legal and ethical behavior. For example, because people in low-context cultures value the written word, they consider written agreements binding and tend to adhere to laws strictly. But high-context cultures put less emphasis on the written word. They consider personal pledges more important than contracts and view laws as flexible. Keep your intercultural messages ethical by applying the 4 basic principles. First, actively seek mutual ground. Both parties must be flexible and avoid insisting that an interaction take place strictly in terms of one culture or another. Second, send and receive messages without judgment. Both parties must recognize that values vary from culture to culture, and they must trust each other. Third, send messages that are honest. Both parties must see things as they are, not as they would like them to be, and must be fully aware of their personal and cultural biases. And fourth, show respect for cultural differences. Both parties must understand and acknowledge the other's needs and preserve each other's dignity. In any culture, rules of social etiquette may be formal or informal. Formal rules of etiquette are explicit and well-defined, but informal rules are learned through observation and imitation. Formal rules are the specifically taught do's and don'ts of how to behave in common social situations, such as table manners at meals. When formal rules are violated, members of a culture can explain why they feel upset. In contrast, informal social rules are more difficult to identify and are usually learned by watching how people behave and then imitating that behavior. When informal rules are violated, members of a culture are likely to feel uncomfortable, although they may not be able to say exactly why. Such informal rules are apparent in the way members value wealth, treat social roles, recognize status, define manners, and think about time. Attitude toward materialism. People in the US emphasize hard work, material status, and efficiency more than people in some other countries do. The predominant US view is that material comfort earned by individual effort is an important goal and that people who work hard are more admirable than those who don't. Each year, US workers spend some 300 more hours on the job than many Germans do, and 60 more than their Japanese peers. As to roles, culture dictates who communicates with whom, what they say, and in what way. Culture also dictates how people should show respect and signify rank. For example, people in the US show respect by addressing top managers as Mr. Roberts or Ms. Williams. In the Philippines, we call our superiors as Sir and Ma'am. Culture also dictates how space is allocated according to the person's socio-economic position. In most US and Philippine offices, the top executives work in spacious, air-conditioned offices apart, while the employees all share a common room. As to manners, the rules of polite behavior vary from country to country. Asking an employee how was your weekend is a common way to make small talk in the US, but the question is intrusive in cultures where business and private life are kept separate. In Arab countries, giving gifts to a co-worker man's wife is impolite, but giving gifts to his children is acceptable. In Germany, giving a woman a red rose is a romantic invitation. In India, if invited to visit someone's home anytime, you should make an unexpected visit without waiting for an invitation. Failure to do so would be an insult. And in terms of time, German and US executives see time as a way to plan the business day efficiently. They focus on only one task during each scheduled period and view time as limited. However, executives from Latin America and Asia see time as more flexible. Meeting deadline is less important than building a business relationship. So the workday is not expected to follow a rigid, preset schedule. Nonverbal communication is extremely reliable in ascertaining meaning. However, that reliability is valid only when communicators belong to the same culture. Nonverbal elements are apparent in attitudes toward personal space and in body language. The concepts of personal space. People in Canada and in the US usually stand about 5 feet apart during a business conversation. However, this distance is uncomfortably close for people from Germany or Japan, and uncomfortably far for Arabs and Latin Americans. Thus, a Canadian manager may react negatively without knowing exactly why when an Arab colleague moves closer during their conversation, and the Arab colleague may react negatively again without knowing why when the Canadian manager backs away. And as to the use of body language, the same gesture can have different meanings from culture to culture. People in the US and in Canada say no by shaking their heads, while people in Bulgaria say no by nodding their heads up and down, and people in Japan say no by moving their right hand. How does cultural context affect business communication? In low-context companies, executive offices are separate with controlled exits, while those in high-context companies, executive offices are shared and open to all. In low-context companies, workers rely on detailed background information, but those in high-context companies, workers do not expect or want detailed information. In low-context companies, information is highly centralized and controlled, while those in high-context companies, information is shared with everyone. In low-context companies, objective data are valued over subjective relationships, while those in high-context companies, subjective relationships are valued over objective data. In low-context companies, business and social relationships are discrete, while those in high-context companies, business and social relationships overlap. In low-context companies, competence is valued as much as position and status, but those in high-context companies, position and status are valued much more than competence. Finally, in low-context companies, meetings have fixed agencies and plenty of advance notice, but those in high-context companies, meetings are often called on short notice and key people always accept. To overcome ethnocentrism, follow these few simple suggestions. First, acknowledge distinctions. Do not ignore the differences between another person's culture and your own. Second, avoid assumptions. Do not assume that others will act the same way you do, that they will operate from the same assumptions, or that they will use language and symbols the same way you do. And third, avoid judgments. When people act differently, don't conclude that they are in error and that their way is invalid or that their customs are inferior to your own. Once you have recognized cultural elements and overcome ethnocentrism, you're ready to focus on your intercultural communication skills. However, don't expect to understand another culture completely. The trick is to use general information while remaining aware of and open to variations and individual differences. You may follow these tips. Assume differences until similarity is proved. Do not assume that others are more similar to you than they actually are. Take responsibility for communication. Do not assume it's the other person's job to communicate with you. Withhold judgment. Learn to listen to the whole story and accept differences in others without judging them. Show respect. Learn how respect is communicated in various cultures through gestures, eye contact, and so on. Empathize. Before sending a message, put yourself in the receiver's shoes. Imagine the receiver's feelings and point of view. Tolerate ambiguity. Learn to control your frustration when placed in an unfamiliar or confusing situation. Look beyond the superficial. Do not be distracted by things such as dress, appearance, or environmental discomforts. Be patient and persistent. If you want to communicate with someone from another culture, don't give up easily. Recognize your own cultural biases. Learn to identify when your assumptions are different from other persons. Be flexible. Be prepared to change your habits and attitudes when communicating with someone from another culture. Emphasize good ground. Look for similarities to work from. Send clear messages. Make both your verbal and nonverbal signals clear and consistent. Deal with the individual. Communicate with each person as an individual, not as a stereotypical representative of another group. Learn when to be direct. Investigate each culture so that you'll know when to send your message in a straightforward manner and when to be indirect. Treat your interpretation as a working hypothesis. Once you think you understand a foreign culture, carefully assess the feedback provided by recipients of your communication to see if it confirms your hypothesis. How should we overcome language barriers? First, avoid using slang and idioms. Languages never translate word for word. They are idiomatic or constructed with phrases that mean more than the sum of their literal parts. When speaking with people less fluent in your language, try to choose words carefully to convey only their most specific denotative meaning. Use words that have singular rather than multiple meanings. For example, high can have 20 meanings, but expensive has one. Second, pay attention to local accents and pronunciation. People coming from different demographics speak differently as well. Foreign accents can make communication difficult. When having trouble understanding someone who has a heavy accent, try the following techniques. Listen very carefully. Rephrase questions. By phrasing questions differently, you allow a non-native speaker to respond using different words, some of which may be easier for you to understand. Expect to understand. Mind tuning toward positive chances of understanding will eventually get its good results rather than focusing on the notion that communicating with others is difficult and even impossible. Create a relaxed atmosphere. Don't rush. Speak slowly. Breathe properly. Listen to the entire message. Words that may be misunderstood in their individual sense are often clarified when placed in the context of a complete message. If you are the speaker with an accent, stop periodically to ask whether the listener understands what you're saying, but don't stop and ask too frequently as to annoy the listener. Request the non-native speaker to write the message on paper. This request would be appropriate for those who are more comfortable expressing ideas in writing than orally. Third, be aware of vocal variations. People use their voices differently from culture to culture. Russian speakers tend to use a flat, level tone, so to some US listeners they sound bored and rude. Middle Easterners tend to speak more loudly than Westerners and may therefore mistakenly be considered more emotional. On the other hand, people from Japan are soft-spoken, a characteristic that implies politeness or humility to Western listeners. Also, many Western cultures interpret silence negatively, thinking that the person lacks adequate verbal skills, that the person is incompatible, or that the person is unwilling to communicate because he or she feels awkward, embarrassed, hostile, disinterested, disapproving, or shy. However, some Asian and Southern African cultures value silence over oral communication. In many of these cultures, the person who talks excessively is regarded with suspicion. And fourth, Match your communication style to your audience. In the US, workers typically prefer an open and direct communication style, considering anything else to be dishonest or insincere. In Sweden, a direct approach is also valued as a sign of efficiency, but unlike discussions in the US, heated debates and confrontations are unusual. Swedish business culture strongly favors compromise. Workers from other cultures, such as Japan or China, tend to be less direct. Finnish and German workers often prefer written communication instead of face-to-face interaction, so a letter recognizing employee accomplishments would be most effective in these cultures. Moreover, Italian, German, and French executives don't soften up colleagues with praise before they criticize. Doing so seems manipulative to them. Develop effective intercultural communication skills by improving your written and oral communication skills. Once you understand what sort of cultural differences you'll be facing, and once you discover which language barriers must be overcome, you need to decide whether using written or oral channels would be best. Then you must adopt your style and approach to make the right impression. If you understand that letter writers in other countries have other customs that you may not be used to, you can focus on the message without passing judgments on the writers. Japanese letter writers, for example, come to the point slowly. They typically begin with a remark about the season or weather, followed by an inquiry about your health or congratulations on your success. A note of thanks for your patronage might come next. After these preliminaries, the main idea is introduced. Be familiar with the written communication preferences of your intercultural readers and adapt your approach, style, and tone to meet their expectations. To write multicultural messages as effectively as possible, follow these recommendations. Use plain English. Use short, precise words that say exactly what you mean. Use climb instead of walk up, maintain instead of keep up, and return instead of bring back. Be clear. Use specific terms and concrete examples to explain your points. Address international correspondence properly. Please refer to the separate lesson about this point. Cite numbers carefully. Use figures instead of spelling them out. However, do not begin sentences with figures of 1 to 12. Avoid slang and idioms. Business communication calls for formal tone. Hence, avoid using informal language, colloquialism, buzzwords, judgments, and other trendy social media lingo. Be brief. Construct shorter and simple sentences instead of complex, compound, and compound-complex sentences. A simple sentence is composed of one subject and one predicate. Also, remove unnecessary words and phrases that would make the sentence thought confusing. Use short paragraphs. Each paragraph should stick to one topic, that is, follow the principle of unity, and be no more than 8 to 10 lines long. And use transitional devices. Transitional devices help readers follow your train of thought by using words that link phrases, clauses, and sentences. Link related points with such expressions as in addition, moreover, first, second, finally. Two, improve your oral skills. If you've ever studied another foreign language, You know that it's easier to write in that language than to conduct a conversation. However, some transactions simply cannot be handled without face-to-face contact. In many countries, business relationships are based on personal relationships, and until you establish rapport, nothing happens. When speaking in English to people who speak English as a second language, you may find these guidelines helpful. Try to eliminate noise. Speak slowly. Pronounce words clearly. Pause at distinct punctuations and make one point at a time. Observe body language. Be alert to roving eyes and glazed looks that signal a listener is lost or confused. Realize that nods and smiles don't necessarily mean understanding, and that gestures and expressions mean different things in different cultures. If the other person's body language seems at odds with the message, take time to clarify the meaning. Clarify your true intent with repetition and examples. Be aware of unintentional meanings that may be read into your message. Do not talk down to other person. Try not to over-enunciate, and don't blame the listener for not understanding. Use phrases such as "I am going too fast" rather than "Is this too difficult for you?" Use objective, accurate language. Avoid throwing around adjectives such as fantastic and fabulous, which people from other cultures might consider unreal and overly dramatic. Learn foreign phrases. Learn common greetings and a few key phrases in the other person's native language in order to establish rapport with the listener. Adapt your conversation style to the other person's. For instance, if the other person appears to be direct and straightforward, follow suit. Check frequently for comprehension. Make one point at a time and pause to check for cues of comprehension before moving on. Clarify what will happen next. At the end of the conversation, be sure that you and the other person agree on what has been said and decided. If appropriate, follow up by writing a letter or a memo summarizing the conversation and thanking the person for meeting with you.